Alrighty, welcome to the Organizing the Green New Deal free professional course number 8. Today we're going to be talking about a lot of stuff related to energy and justice. We've got a really excellent speaker today who's also been participating really actively in the course the whole time. I know her professionally in the Pacific Northwest and know that she's very, very solid and smart. This is Heather Moline, and she is the policy associate at Northwest Energy Coalition. And she also, I love this bio, by the way, I'm gonna read the whole thing. So Heather Moline describes herself as an angry incrementalist working on justice, equity, diversity, inclusion in the utility sector in the Pacific Northwest. She's interested in the distribution system, energy burden mitigation, accurate resource and impact evaluation, and how to increase literacy and meaningful collaboration in the energy space for regulators and advocates alike. Before the pandemic, she would have tried to get you interested in social Irish and Cuban salsa dancing. So there's a lot there for questions, you know, if people want to go off the energy piece. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen and then we're going to go from there. Share this. Share. Okay, how does that look for folks?
Looks good
to me.
Okay, great. And then one problem is I cannot see my mouse for some reason with Keynote here. So, okay. Can you see like a thing in the middle of a sharing box in the middle of the screen there?
Nope. Looks
okay.
Good.
Fine then. All right, go for it, Heather, and just let me know when to click forward.
Can do. And apologies to folks. I kind of sprung this on Nick and Breach Collective today, like, hey, can you forward slides for me? So Nick is trying to figure this out and he's succeeding. Good job, Nick. So hi, I'm Heather. I see a number of names I recognize and that's cool. I wanted to preface by saying, you know, this course is about how dangerous incrementalism is. So when I say I'm an incrementalist, I don't believe that it's worth our time and effort for everyone to do what I do. And I don't believe that it can't be even suicidal, which is what Mitch Green said 2 weeks ago, I think. I just mean that I'm really, really interested in the weeds as opposed to greater systems thinking. And that the reality is that things happen all the time that are making people's lives better or worse, that are very small, and that those things kind of happen behind an iron curtain of bureaucracy where utilities are there, maybe folks like me are there, but there's no one else there. And it's that stuff I'm interested in paying attention to and helping other people understand. And also, if any of you read the amazing article by Dr. Shalonda Baker that was in the recommended reading, we can take incremental steps towards transformation. They are not altogether different things. So that's my preface. The other thing I would say is that I'm a practitioner. I'm not an academic. I've been working in the policy arena for 10 years. But before that, I worked in social services, before that, popular education. And I spend a lot of time around people who Adrienne Maree Brown, if any of you have read Adrienne Maree Brown, would call visionary talkers, who have great stories and great ideas and great theories, but are kind of afraid or don't know how to walk and talk with people. And I don't want to be one of those. And I like when people keep me accountable to not being one of those people. So last sort of qualifier I'd offer is that I don't work day in and day out on the front lines of the climate crisis. I'm not a member of an environmental justice community. I don't represent the perspectives of anyone in the environmental justice community, but I used to do that work, and it informs how I show up as an advocate and informs me being a facilitator and information provider for folks who do that work and who are part of those communities. But also, I'm not the best spokesperson for things like energy justice, energy democracy. I just like the weeds. So here we go. We can go to the next slide. So quick outline. Goals are just to better understand the grid and the utility sector in particular, how they are regulated, and also to empower all of us here as Green New Deal advocates with actual solutions to ecological and social crises, which kind of coordinate with the solutions required to fix this very outdated grid that we are all living with right now. And you can pay attention, I did some nice color coding. Anything I put in green, I see as like a real world solution that is not just a theory, but is things that people are putting into practice. So we're gonna look at the way the grid used to look. We're gonna look at the way the grid now looks and the way it's going to look in the future. We'll look at what this looks like in the context of the Pacific Northwest. We'll just do a quick foray into the US energy mix, where the United States gets its energy from, what it's used for. Then we'll look at investor-owned utilities and consumer-owned utilities. We'll look at how utilities are regulated, in particular by public utility commissions, PUCs, and a cool tool called performance-based regulation. And then of course, we're gonna talk about Texas because that was nuts. And we'll also talk about some very cool stuff going on in Washington State around the Clean Energy Transformation Act, otherwise called CETA. Then some key takeaways. And then because Nick tends to ask this, or someone does, I just included a slide on how you can get involved in things if you want to. So take a look at this and let's see in the chat why this is not actually what the grid looks like. I know all of you already know the answer to this, so I want to know, why is this not actually what the grid looks like? Because this was sent to me by a utility employee. This is sort of a utility-centric perspective on the things that bring us energy. And let's see what ideas folks have about why that's not actually the case. Don't be shy. You can't just coast through this presentation. This is going to require some participation out of folks.
Yeah, this class tends to take a little bit to warm up. After like 30 minutes, start firing them off.
Thank you, Ben. Yes, there is electric generation at houses now, not just generating plants. Any other ideas? Oh. Voss is saying he can't see anyone else's comments. Oh, okay. Yeah, when you type things into the chat, make sure you type 2 panelists and attendees. These are great. You all are getting the point.
Can you read some of the ones in there, Heather?
Yeah.
Watching this later on YouTube and stuff.
Voss pointed out that this system is not just producing electricity, it's also producing carbon emissions, and that's not accounted for here. And Ben pointed out residential generation is not on this. Why is it not really the grid? Good question, Micah. Let's go to the next slide. I'm sorry, but this is actually more what the grid looks like. And what it's going to look like. I will give folks a minute to absorb what they're seeing, because some of this might be very new, and some of these words on the bottom, I didn't even know what they meant. I had to look them up. So just take a minute to look over this slide. Yes, Valerie says, the previous slide didn't even look like a grid. The grid functions more like a network, and that was more a straight line. Yep. Julie says, doesn't always get distributed well or evenly, that's for sure. So, you know, this is not, I haven't really found a very good equity-centric map of what the grid looks like, or even like an infographic. This is not a thing that I've found that exists yet. It might, I just don't know where it is. So This does not actually take into account what Julie said, which is some places get benefits and some places get burdens in the grid. But taking a look at this, I know there's at least one engineer on the call. Engineering is not my strong suit, by the way, but this is sort of an engineer's perspective of what the grid is. So we've got lots of distribution substations rather than one large central plant. So in the previous slide, we saw a generating facility. That's the center, that's where everything starts. The reality is that generation happens a lot of places. Distribution tends to start from a lot of places also. We've also got solar plants in the lower left, and those are called utility scale solar plants because they're large scale, but there's also distributed solar, meaning smaller scale solar in the lower right, which implies residential and commercial scale solar. Then we've got lots of demand response, DR here. DR is an acronym we'll talk a little bit about on the next slide. We've got VAR compensators, which essentially provide fast response, high voltage power when it's needed in a pinch. So during a crisis, that would have been very useful to have in Texas recently. We have electric vehicles, which function as batteries when used well. And if they're going to be single occupancy vehicles in the future, they're going to be electric. So like it or not, electric vehicles are here to stay. And they can store solar and wind to be used later, which is why they are great as batteries. And then of course, we've got microgrids. We've got small grids with the ability to function when they are not connected to the rest of the grid, as pictured in the lower right. We've got real-time information. So increasingly, technology is allowing us, my household, for example, to share information with my utility about how much energy am I using at any given hour, sometimes even down to the minute in some places, which is very helpful for whoever's providing my power to be able to keep up with my demand as it changes. Oh, that was not possible in the grid traditionally. And I think one thing to notice here at the top is all of this real-time information, distributed generation, demand response has to be managed by someone. On a macro level, that's managed by a balancing authority, which I won't talk about unless folks want to know what that is. But in the case of Texas, for example, we heard the word ERCOT a lot, which is an acronym that stands for Electric Reliability Council of Texas. So that entity is the balancing authority for Texas. It's their job to make sure supply matches demand on the grid at all times. Otherwise you get blackouts, which is what happened. So someone has to manage all of this. And the question is who? And on the right, so for those of you who read Dr. Baker's article, this management can be done really well. It can be done in a movement toward what she would call anti-resilience, or it can be used in a way that further disenfranchises and even endangers people, and the same people who have been endangered over and over and over. So in Dr. Baker's words, the smart grid, which is this thing that we're looking at, the information it requires, distributed rather than centralized power, absolutely needs community mediation in order to operate successfully. This can't just be done by utility or by ERCOT, for example. So this is kind of a key point for us to keep in mind, that if folks like me and like us who are showing up now and demanding things like localized generation, more consumer participation, real-time accessible information. If we had done that 40 years ago, grid operators would have been like, have no idea how we're going to do that. That's ridiculous. That's way beyond our technological capacity. But now it's happening. It's happening whether we like it or not. And the question is, will we be a part of it? Will we be a part of the control mechanisms, or will we continue to perpetuate the same systems? And the fact that all of this is happening, all of this real-time information, distributed generation, it's very freaky to utilities because utilities are part of the system as it was designed. And for that, Nick, I'm hoping we can go back one slide again. So now that we know what the grid looks like and will look like in the future, I think it's important to keep in context why the grid was designed the way it was designed, which was thanks to the New Deal. And this is a Green New Deal course, so that's relevant to us for sure. In the early 1930s, only 27% of farms in this country were electrified. And Roosevelt is famous for saying, at that point in time, electricity is no longer a luxury, it is a necessity of human life. So that's interesting because even they agreed that electricity is a need, which is why they spent so much money and so much infrastructure electrifying America. And so in his New Deal package, he forwarded the Rural Electrification Act, REA. After that act, 59% of farms in the country had electricity as opposed to 27. And that happened in 4 years. So that is very, very fast. That is a lot of infrastructure built very quickly. And so it's important to keep in mind that a lot of our energy infrastructure in the country is that old, and it's designed for fast, cheap delivery, which means economies of scale, which means large and few and far between generation, sending their power to the far reaches of the frontier, to customers, communities, farms in that case, who were like, great, we'll take it. This is what we need, thank you. And there wasn't much community mediation as we just talked about. So that's how the grid was designed, and that's not how the grid works now or what it's going to look like in the future. Before we go on to the slide 2 forward from here, I want to know if folks have questions or comments so far. And I don't think I see any. Okay. Okay, I think we can go ahead a couple, Nick. Cool. So we saw a picture of the smart grid. Let's dig into the weeds a little bit. Some of you may have heard the term demand side management. Again, a lot of these terms that are thrown around in the energy sector are very utility perspective central. All demand side management means is you can influence the energy system from a supply perspective. And honestly, there's a lot of attention behind that around things like preventing fossil fuel plants from being built, pipelines, et cetera. All that is very important, and it exists because there is demand. There's demand for it. Demand side management is a more smart grid centric approach that says you can motivate consumers to contribute to the electric grid through a change in their timing or demand of electricity use. And what does this actually mean in practice? So one thing it looks like is energy efficiency, right? So conserving energy as opposed to building new plants is always the least risky, least uncertain, most cost-effective option. So almost all utilities are required before thinking about building a new natural gas plant to think about energy efficiency. Texas is not a very well-regulated state. Surprise. So energy efficiency is not really a thing that they do very well, which means that when a crisis hits and supply shuts down, they have blackouts. It can also look like demand response, DR, which we saw a slide ago, which means changing prices or offering rebates depending on how much you use at different times of day. It can also mean appliances, giving credits for appliances that automatically dial up or dial down depending on when our energy is more expensive to provide, et cetera. And the fact is that, the grid is going to look like this. So it's important for folks to ask questions about the fact that it's making these changes. So here are some things to be aware of. The first is that what I often hear is, why is it on us as consumers to change? Like, why demand side management? Why shouldn't the utilities who are have made lots of money on coal be required to change? And that is very valid. But part of the answer is that if you're going to go all wind and solar, the sun only shines and the wind only blows at certain times of day. So you're either going to need a lot of batteries, electric vehicles, other types of storage to save up that energy for other times of day. And we heard a bit from Dr. Rio Francos, I forget when that was, 3-4 weeks ago, about why relying on very extraction-centric technology to power our grid is not always the best choice. Or you're going to have to motivate people to consume energy differently than they have at different times of day, more when there's wind and solar available, less when it's not. So that's why at least some demand side strategies are really important. But connected to that, there are very, very real concerns and real mess ups and harm that's been done regarding communities whose security has been compromised, whose identities have been stolen, who for various other reasons, like doubts about vaccines, doubts about the medical system, have every reason to doubt what an energy provider is going to do with their data, with their real-time data. And so how that data gets used is a very, very scary arena that we need to pay attention to. However, one thing to be cautious of, what I hear a lot from utilities is, we don't want to do that because we're concerned about security. So if a community member tells me that, I'm like, I get it. If a utility tells me that, some of that is very silly because, for example, we've asked PGE for a map of where people have solar in Portland. And from some folks, we got the feedback that is not a safe thing to have a map of. You can Google that. You can Google where there are solar panels in Portland. So let's be cautious of that reason when utilities offer it. So consumer, prosumer. We will talk a little bit about this when we talk about municipalization. But in the same way that taking power away from investor-owned utilities, for example, and giving it to people, and taking profits away and giving it to people requires a shift in power. There's also sort of a way that in the smart grid, those of us who've had it easy, those of us who have just kind of walked into a room and flipped on our light and yay, things work, we're going to have to pay a lot more attention and be a lot more participatory in our energy system. And there was a researcher, I forget where, in the Southwest, who said, forget this term consumer of energy, we need prosumers of energy, meaning participation, meaning acknowledging that people are providing energy solutions rather than just receiving them. And again, there's potential here for very good things in the way that Dr. Baker talked about community mediation of the energy system. But the point is, it requires a lot of consciousness. Energy has been something that's just been, invisibly provided. It's kind of a discourse in and of itself. When we say energy, we're not actually thinking about turning our stove on or the things that we use it for. We're thinking about, oh, the energy system, this far away idea. And that's not how it's going to be treated in the future. That said, I also want to acknowledge that there are many people who haven't been able to take the energy system for granted, maybe because they've struggled with energy poverty, or they've grown up in the sacrifice zones of the fossil fuel industry. And I'm not saying that we need those folks to pay attention and participate more. You all are doing great. I'm saying the rest of us will need to step up a little bit. And sort of the last thing I wanted to mention is, again, not just becoming prosumers, but what are the possibilities in the smart grid? The smart grid that's more in front of our face, that's more directly connected to our lives for energy democracy. And when I say energy democracy, I mean taking control of resources and decision-making that has been held by corporations, and using that control to empower communities that have been disenfranchised in the past, particularly working people, low income, and communities of color. So there are a lot of opportunities here. I'm gonna look at the chat. Sherry, what kind of regulations are in place to protect customers? I'm thinking you're talking about data security. And there's actually quite a bit. So sometimes when utilities say we can't because of security, like there are very clear FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, rules that say you absolutely cannot ask that. And sometimes the things are state related, like when it comes to certain kinds of income data or demographic data, there can be restrictions. But it's always good to question when that comes up. Not just data security, but how the utilities will use the information. Right, so there are definitely FERC regulations on some of that. And sometimes there are not. There was a very scary story that I posted on Twitter recently. A utility in the Southwest using customer data to, ICE, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, using utility data to find undocumented customers. Whoa. So this is a very real reason to be concerned. And I'm not sure where protections are in place there, but I have a feeling there weren't protections in place. I see Max has asked, what is a sacrifice zone? Good question. So that was covered in the Shalonda Baker reading. And what we mean by that, we will actually cover later when we talk about Port Arthur, Texas. But it's a place where fossil fuel infrastructure is heavily concentrated and where there are people right next to it. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so I think the Pacific Northwest is an interesting example of all this, not only because I live here and I like living here, but because we have very few fossil fuel resources compared to the rest of the country, compared to the rest of the world. We purchase far less coal and gas than other parts of the country. So, we don't have coal or gas resources in our own land, but we also bring in less of it. So some of, when Dr. Baker talks about the fossil fuel economy, some of it applies a little less to the Pacific Northwest. But some people in the energy industry here are like, oh, we've got this figured out. We've got hydro, like we're totally fine. This doesn't apply to us. Whoa. So looking at some of the trade-offs of having a hydropower system and the smart grid of the Pacific Northwest. We're very hydro dependent. All these blue dots that you see in the background here, the larger size dots mean larger projects. That's where dams are located in our region. We even export a lot of hydro to California. And some of the benefits of that are hydropower is 100% free of direct emissions. The hydro system is mostly federally created and federally operated by the Bonneville Power Administration. So Bonneville Power Administration is a public entity. It's part of the US Department of Energy, and it can't make any profit on its power. It provides power at cost, which means that it's very affordable. And it means that we have some of the lowest electricity rates in the country. So that, for some people, has been very nice. And it means that consumer-owned utilities, which we'll talk about in a bit, in particular are all over that power, right? They're going to look for the cheapest way to provide power to their customers, to their members that they can. And it's also benefited industrial farming and agriculture quite a bit. I'm sure that does not come surprise to people. So when we talk about dam removal, those are the people who show up and are freaked out. On the other side, I think most people here know that the Columbia River and its tributaries are fundamental and sacred to indigenous ways of life in the region. Whole villages were wiped out to make room for these dams. Those impacts are very rarely discussed in the halls of power, and they're not very well quantifiable. There are economists now who are assigning a value to reparations for slavery, who are saying like in the trillions of dollars, that's how much we owe African Americans. I've not seen anything like that in the Pacific Northwest. I would be interested to see something like that because it would be astronomical, and we do not talk about it. But also very currently, salmon and fish in general, big hydropower, if not designed well, is very, very bad for fish. And salmon in particular are a keystone species, so important in the food chain in this region, in this ecosystem. And so Northwest Energy Coalition, that's who I work for, I think we've been sort of suing Bonneville Power for like 15 years now, and we're not the only ones, because there are real costs to a system like this. The other thing to keep in mind is, again, I said that consumer-owned utilities eat up hydropower because it's so cheap. But consumer-owned utilities can't attract investment because they're consumer-owned, right? Their only monetary base is the people who pay into the system. They can't get millions of dollars to do fancy things from elsewhere, which means this. These consumer-owned utilities can't do very much that's innovative, or they're afraid to because it would cost their ratepayers quite a lot. So that's something to keep in mind when we talk about investor and consumer-owned utilities in a bit. And then I kind of covered this already, but you know, as this system becomes more human-centric and as people have more access to distributed resources, it's going to require more of us to pay attention and more of us to participate. But I wanted to, in particular, talk about natural gas for a sec, which is probably better called fracked gas. I will be the first to say that I think there might be a role for natural gas to play in our energy future. If you look at most 100% clean policies that have passed in the country, most of them leave some kind of room for a little natural gas, even if it's through offsets and that sort of thing. I'm not saying I'm 100% sure of this, but I think we need to keep that in mind. However, natural gas is expanding out the wazoo, right? It's cheap. More and more hookups happening every day. That does not make sense given science. Most people agree that that does not make sense given the science of climate change. And it has a huge lobby power. Natural gas has a huge lobby power. Of course, coal and oil are impressive too, but those are not as economically competitive anymore. Natural gas is very economically competitive. Partnership for Energy Progress, I would just invite folks to Google that. It sounds like a great thing, and it's a way to sort of disguise the natural gas lobby, I'll put it that way. Just gonna take a minute to look at the chat here. Yeah. So Mike is saying the biggest barrier to industry growth of rooftop solar is uncooperative utilities who own the grid. How do we create a public electrical transmission system that encourages everyone to connect with distributed solar? Mike, I think we'll talk some about that I don't know much about the transmission system. I'm going to name that right now. That's more federally regulated, and I do more state and regional stuff. But transmission system capacity, like what there's space for, is a real challenge. And I'm, when utilities say that, like, there's not space on the transmission system, that's the thing. At the same time, it's very smart to be cautious about who gets to see the transmission data. And I know that probably you and others in the solar industry have a lot of fights about data availability and accessibility on transmission and distribution lines, because it turns out, utilities will say we don't have space for that. And then a year later, a third-party engineer gets involved and is like, actually, you totally have space for that. You weren't calculating right. So it's, again, important for data to be accessible and visible. Do you see the role of fracked gas as a tool to help us meet national energy demands while we transition to a greener energy profile, or a resource that would be relied upon indefinitely? Yeah, so is it a transition fuel, or is it something that will be permanently installed? I don't know enough about that, Max. Yeah, I have not read in-depth natural gas transition studies, but I know that we are very rapidly moving into a future, especially if we get a handle on this storage stuff in a way that is not extractive and dangerous and perpetuates colonization. We're very quickly moving into a future where, yeah, natural gas might be useful now, but not later.
Yeah, there's a lot of anticipation that rates are going to rise pretty dramatically in the near future for gas. And this is something, basically the fights in the Pacific Northwest, at least, and this may be true elsewhere around the country, and California is having similar stuff. People are trying to like prevent new gas infrastructure from being built out, and then figure out basically how to like unwind a significant degree of that that's already in place. And the gas industry basically is taking the tact that they're actually renewables companies in disguise, and that they're going to be able to supply all of their gas needs through what they're calling like renewable natural gas, and then later are going to be able to like replace all of their gas use entirely with like green hydrogen. And probably not the space to unpack that in total, but mostly the math doesn't work economically or scientifically on that. So we can put a place marker in that one and come back to it in future sessions, or maybe in the Q&A.
And I do think that, Breach, others who talk about fossil fuel infrastructure, in a better place to answer that. I will say, though, something you alluded to, we are going to go more electric, right? Our cars are going more electric, our buildings are going more electric, meaning we're moving away from oil, we are moving away from natural gas. The problem is that the people who can afford to do that first, yay, how nice for them, perpetuates the same cycle of the costs, the burdens, getting left with the people who can afford it the least. So the cost of the natural gas system as we transition, if we don't do it well, we'll be left with people who can't afford it and who've had to live with fossil fuel fumes their whole lives. So there's a whole bunch that's happening in California, for example, about equitable gas transition. That's really interesting. And again, folks in the Green New Deal space, we're not just 100% clean as fast as possible. How is that being done, right? Yeah. Okay, let's keep going. So this is just fun, I think. From the US Energy Information Administration, USEIA. And on the left, you'll see sources of our energy. So this is not just electricity, right? This also includes petroleum. And on the right, you'll see what it's used for. So for example, the top number in red on top of the arrow says 70, which means that 70% of petroleum goes to transportation. And then the 91 on the top right means that 91% of what's used for transportation comes from petroleum. And what I think is most interesting about this, y'all can notice what you notice, is the very bottom, electrical system energy losses. So that is a large percent of energy loss that is not used for anything. What can we do about that? So most of this loss is from thermal power plants, which means fossil fuel and nuclear, which means as we get away from fossil fuels, surprise, we're getting a more efficient grid. And as we get away from nuclear as well. But that's not everything. The other thing is power plants in and of themselves, regardless of what kind of source they use, require electricity to run. And that is counted as a loss. So the electricity that a power plant needs to operate does not have an end use here. So it's considered a loss to the system. And there are other losses that as you send energy across transmission lines, you are going to lose it. It doesn't get 100% sent to its destination. So energy efficiency, I'm going to keep coming back to energy efficiency, and demand response help a lot here. Part of the reason for that, like I said, is that energy efficiency and demand response mean you have to run your power plants less because you don't need as much, there isn't as much demand because you've conserved. But the other thing, I want to mention that, when I saw this, I was like, okay, if there's line losses, meaning energy has to get sent a long way on a transmission line before it gets used, does that mean that distributed generation, so local generation close to all of us as opposed to far away, would reduce some of the losses? And the answer is yes, but that's not the biggest problem because most of the losses are on the distribution side, as it turns out, not the transmission side. So that means because we're building more and more stuff that needs energy to be powered, more buildings, et cetera, in our local communities, that's where we lose a lot of our efficiency in the system, which is another reason why demand response and energy efficiency, as opposed to localized generation, as opposed to everyone getting solar panels, is a smart investment. Okay, I think we can move on. Okay, I've been referring to utilities, and I think I referred to consumer-owned utilities / public power at one point. So the first thing I want to say before launching into this slide is I agree that it's a little messed up, maybe even a lot messed up, that a human right, what I think it's a human right, energy access needs to be a human right, is provided through a market. That is weird. That said, there are pros and cons to both of these models, and some of them are here. So on the left, we have investor-owned utilities, which tend to be a lot bigger. As said in their names, they are profit-driven industries. They invest in things by attracting investment. They have stockholders, they operate on Wall Street, et cetera, et cetera. They are regulated by utility commissions, which we'll talk about in another slide. Then you have consumer-owned utilities. So these are run through government entities as through municipalities, for example, cooperatives, or something called public utility districts. They are sometimes parts of them are accountable to the state commission, public utility commission, but mostly they're accountable to very local boards of directors and to their members. Because they're not powered by Wall Street, benefits stay in the community, right? They're not sending profit elsewhere. But I also say some benefits stay in the community because, again, in the investor-owned utility world, you can attract a lot of money, big sums of money that you can use to do really cool things, like very high workforce standards, for example. In a consumer-owned utility, you can still afford to do that. But if you are a very small rural consumer-owned utility, like a lot of them in Oregon or Washington, you're going to exercise some caution before raising your rates to do that sort of thing, because a lot of people are poor. Just going to get some water. Consequently, because these things, a lot of these consumer-owned utilities are very small, are rural, they're out of the public's eye, and there's a higher potential for industry to capture their interests. I cannot say that this is the case across the country. I know this is very true in the Pacific Northwest, though. So what can we do about this? For those of you who are here during week 1, we heard Femi say, I hear energy democracy folks talking with not totally rose-colored glasses about public utilities and municipalization. So municipalization means we don't want energy to be provided through a market by investors. We want it to be provided as a public service through the government. So we're going to turn our investor-owned utility into a consumer-owned utility. I mean, it's not actually that simple, but that's the general idea. That can really work if you know what you're getting into. And there are not a lot of examples of it working out really well that I know of, but we're also getting better at it. So for example, because industry capture is easier, you've got to make sure you have a community that can really watchdog your industry, that you have a very active community. And if you want progressive outcomes, if you want a progressive board of directors, progressive movement, you need to make sure to have a very progressive voting base. And there are some examples of, over time, especially in rural America, the demographics change and there aren't as many progressives. And suddenly this consumer-owned utility that was really backed by strong progressive ideals is taken over by industry. The other thing, it is very expensive to create a municipal utility. So I say this from the perspective of someone who used to work in low-income energy assistance world. There are people who will have to pay a lot of money to make that happen. And if there are rich people to shoulder that burden, great. But you have to make sure that people who have higher incomes are able to shoulder more of that burden, and that people who have lower incomes pay a little less. And if you can't guarantee that, or if you have all one sort of homogenous group of ratepayers that have about the same income, it's going to cost them a lot. And then the other thing to pay attention to is, going green very fast is not our goal here. But if your goal is to go green really fast, and maybe even if your goal is to provide the kinds of specific outcomes that Dr. Baker in the anti-resilience article was talking about, it may not be the best strategy to municipalize. Notice she did not outright recommend municipalization in her article. And there are alternative ways to go about this that without municipalizing that we can talk about. All that to say, I'm not saying don't, I'm just saying know what you're getting into.
Yeah, I might editorialize just briefly here if you don't mind, Heather. But yeah, for folks who know me, it's probably not surprising. I've thought about this quite a bit. And one of the major impediments tends to just be like the logistics of acquiring assets. And that's very, very expensive to try to take over utility. If you can do it kind of functionally, let's say that you can like get it on the ballot, which in my city happened like 20 years ago and it didn't pass because the utility was able to kind of like spend into the election and convince people it was a bad idea. But Boulder, for example, was able to like pass a law to attempt to take it over. And the utilities attorneys have just been like stringing out the eminent domain process and asset acquisition process for like 10 years or something. Sorry, my dog hears something. So like, even if you can functionally and technologically do it, sorry, everybody, there's like a legal cost that's just huge, and the utilities can recover their legal costs by charging ratepayers basically in a lot of cases. And so they don't really lose any money fighting it, and you have to pour tons of money in to try to take over those assets. So you know, you could imagine a world in which like the federal government was just like printing money and like buying everybody out and using eminent domain and kind of like eliminating that shortcut, or eliminating that kind of fight. But from the municipal side of having to fight that, it's very costly. So I'm not saying don't do it. And I'm not even saying, I think tactically, if organizing around that is probably like a really, really smart thing to do, to be able to like even get close to a capacity to do that, just because you will scare the shit out of utilities and then
yes,
negotiate with you more. So
that's true. It's true. Thank you. That was good editorializing. Yeah. Valerie, what is the difference between municipalization and nationalization? I have not heard the term nationalization.
That just means like the federal government would buy out industry or something like that, use eminent domain authority.
Got it.
And that hasn't really happened in the American context probably since like World War II was like the last time nationalization was really a thing that was happening.
Okay, we can go on. So this stuff, I really, nice sound effect, Nick. First of all, he and I don't know why this ended up upside down, but it's pretty coincidental. Anyway, this stuff is very fascinating to me, so I'm sorry if it's boring to the rest of you, but I'm really interested in how utilities are regulated, which means, you know, overseen by the government. So energy is such a complicated, expensive, large-scale thing that utilities are natural monopolies, because it doesn't really make sense for there to be multiple sets of energy providers, each building their own separate set of transmission and distribution lines, or for various providers to like knock at your door and say, we want to provide energy for your house. And then you'd say, great, and you'd sign something, and then they'd switch who uses the distribution lines. Anyway, the point is that it makes sense for a utility to have a service territory that only it oversees. But you can't have a monopoly in the United States without being regulated. So there's this thing called the Regulatory Compact, which means in exchange for being given a granted service territory, a utility must supply customers with all the energy they need at a reasonable price, including, if you're an investor in utility, a return on your investment, meaning a profit. And so that agreement is called a regulatory compact. And you'll hear all the wonks talking about that all the time. But fair warning, the regulatory compact is not a written law. Several public utility commissions in states use the term regulatory compact as like a shorthand description of regulation. Like they just mean we're regulated. But they want it to mean that we are guaranteed a return on our investment for providing the service to you, which it does not mean. There's never been a court decision that has concluded that a utility is legally entitled to relief or profit. So in fact, I think there are lots of examples of courts rejecting that argument. So the point is, if you ever hear utilities say we can't because of the regulatory compact, look into it a little more. Okay, I am going to focus mostly on state and regional level regulation, just because I don't know as much about FERC or federal stuff, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. But I thought it would be important to mention here that while some things are regulated on the state level, which we're going to spend a little more time on, some things that the federal level regulates include interstate infrastructure, so pipelines, anything that requires NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. So if you want to build a fossil fuel plant, you definitely need to go through the federal government, and transmission lines. Like Mark, I think it was Mike, the solar person on this call was saying, transmission and who has control of transmission is a real issue when it comes to questions of equity and justice. And that is a thing that the feds oversee mostly. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about what utility regulation looks like on a state level. The entities that regulate investor-owned utilities in the state and some parts of consumer-owned utilities. So for instance, safety, questions of safety are regulated by, are ways in which consumer-owned utilities are regulated by public utility commissions. Anyway, the state level entity is called a utility commission, and in various states, they're called various things. In some places it's the Railroad Commission because they started out regulating railroads. But in general, they're known as utility commissions. And they're made up of commissioners who are generally appointed by governors, and then their staff. So the commissioners make decisions, but the staff do all the work. They do all the analysis, and they provide the analysis to the commissioners, and they say, we recommend that you blah, blah, blah. And then the commissioners say yes or no. So that's how they're structured. And really what they exist to do, and I don't think they would like that I say this, but they exist to decide whether investor-owned utilities should make money based on what they've done. So utilities present their plans to the commissioners in the hopes that, you know, we're doing our due diligence. We want to make sure that these are good investments. And then they carry out the plans. And once their plans are carried out, the commissioners look at what they've done and they say, that was a prudent investment, meaning you did good, or that was not a prudent investment. And if the latter is the case, it's the stockholders, shareholders who have to assume that cost. And if the former is the case, if the investment was determined prudent, then that becomes a part of rates. And this is how that works. And I'm not going to spend too much time here because it's super wonky. What utilities make is called the revenue requirement. So what should the utility be allowed to charge customers in order to reasonably cover its cost? And that calculation is the rate base of investment. And so the rate base is the total of all long-lived investments made by the utility to serve customers. So that includes buildings, power plants, fleet vehicles, meaning vehicles they use for transport, office furniture, poles, wires, transformers, pipes, computers, et cetera, et cetera. That's all part of the rate base. The rate of return is the profit that they're allowed to make. And then the operating expenses are, in general, operating expenses means things like paying for staff, paying consultants, et cetera. So here's the thing about that equation. It is an outdated way to regulate a utility because of two things called capital bias and the throughput incentive. Capital bias means that utilities are biased through this equation to build things, to undertake capital projects. Because you'll notice in the equation, their rate of return is multiplied by their rate base, meaning the more things that they build, the higher their profit is. So the more things you build, the better you're doing. And that again ties back to the reason that the grid was created, which was to build things really fast. Sorry, I'm gonna get water again. Okay, my bad. And then the throughput incentive is a fancy way of saying that utilities are incentivized to provide more energy, to grow demand, right? So in the Green New Deal arena, we're all very cautious of growth as a good thing. And this is a way to sort of put a check on that. Bummer. Okay. It doesn't have to work this way. there's a thing that a bunch of states have tried out or will try out called performance-based regulation, which is really complicated. And in fact, this map is kind of outdated. I know a number of other states have tried it, that says we're going to create a new formula by which utilities make money. And we're going to decide as the public how to evaluate these utilities. It's not going to be based on how much you build. It's going to be based on, and you can fill in the blank here, how well you mitigate energy burden, resolve energy poverty, how much solar you incorporate. And so this is also not a cheap thing and a simple thing to do, but it's an alternative to the conventional capital bias model. And I'm going to stop there, drink some more water, and see if there's any questions or comments.
Yeah, I might add here too that there's, to kind of tie a bow on this section here, utilities generally are going to advocate at state public utility commissions through what are called integrated resource plans that they should be able to build and operate more energy production because they want to hold that on their books because, as Heather noted, they get to make a bigger rate of return on that. And so there are fights a lot of times over whether, especially now when renewables are becoming much cheaper to get online, and there are developers that are putting those online, and there are some requirements that utilities, are supposed to just buy that if it's available and on the market. So there are big fights around that happen a lot. And in Oregon, there have been several around natural gas producing facilities that utilities have tried to bring online, and then climate advocates will fight them and get really, really deep into the integrated resource plans to try to make their cases.
And thank goodness there are advocates paying attention to integrated resource plans, because that's really where the rubber hits the road, if that's the saying. Okay, we can go to Texas. Next slide. So I knew I wouldn't get out of here without talking about Texas, what happened in Texas. So here we go. Those of you who read the Dr. Baker piece saw that she grew up in Port Arthur, Texas, which is a sacrifice zone, what she calls a sacrifice zone. And so let's just take a moment to name that Texas is ground zero for a lot of things. Fossil fuel pollution, high concentrations of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, the Gulf of Mexico, which is on the edge of ecological collapse, and now this ice storm. So there was this ice storm with freezing temperatures, which led people to crank up their heat because Texas doesn't do cold very well, which led to really high demand. And in the meantime, supply froze. So especially gas and coal froze. Some wind farms actually froze too, but far fewer of them. And that meant that when you have too much demand and not enough supply, ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, started shutting people off, did what's called rolling blackouts. And sort of the other thing that contributed to this is hilarious, because an old professor of mine told me Texas is in great shape because it has its own grid. So if the grid collapses, they can take care of themselves. But what if Texas collapses? Their own grid, which means they couldn't get generation from anyone else, which means that we couldn't send them supply from other places because they have their own grid. So they couldn't get generation elsewhere. And then the other thing, of course, Texas has a deregulated market, and that's kind of a complicated thing, but it means that power production is not owned by utilities the way it is in Oregon, for example, and customers choose their own energy retailer, which also means that the costs get passed to customers, which means that some customers, after this supply crisis, were hit with $20,000 bills that would not happen in Oregon. And then of course, Texas in general is a place where the market rules, which means there aren't really government incentives or regulation to do things like weatherize homes or pipelines, which is very cheap until it's not in this case. So the fixes, I think none of this is new to anyone. So I'll only spend so much time on this, but I wanted to give you the term distributed energy resources. You'll see this acronym a lot, DERs, which are physical and virtual assets that are deployed across the distribution grid, typically close to demand. And they can be used to either provide value to the grid or to individual customers. All that boils down to is they include things like solar panels, storage, energy efficiency, demand side management, which we saw a few slides ago, electric vehicles. And so again, because these things are closer to customers, they are more resilient when supply blacks out. Connectedly, it's a very bad idea to rely, I mean, again, you all know this, on just fossil fuels or on fossil fuels at all. It's a very good idea to have a diverse portfolio, right? Diverse sources of generation, which is why some folks are like, there's enough, you know, solar in Morocco for us to power the whole world or something like that. Maybe, but diverse resources is also a good idea. And then for those of you who read the Shalonda Baker article again, in all of this, we want to keep in mind decolonizing the energy system. So I found the article really powerful for quotes like this one. She cites somebody named Lenin who said, the racial and class-based hierarchies that privileged white property owners held over landless laborers stayed firmly intact as the Industrial Revolution ignited the ascendance of fossil fuels. In other words, the fossil fuel economy is like the new wave of slavery. So again, this sacrifice zone in Port Arthur is trapping the same people. And we are all familiar with this framework of colonization, decolonization. So as we look for distributed energy resources and diverse generation, we need to make sure we are decolonizing. And the how of this is more interesting. So that's sort of the what. The how of this, there is very little talk about how to value resources based on their location, right? So solar panels on a community center, for example, are of great value to people in that community, a lot more than a natural gas plant a state away. Similarly, what's the value of solar plus storage during a right after an earthquake, and the value of a microgrid after an earthquake? Right now, there are not very good metrics to say that is a very valuable thing to have. And Dr. Baker would say it's not just about, you know, making sure people have power, but attaching vulnerability metrics to that. So where are there people who need this because they haven't benefited from the past? And how can we write those metrics alongside things like who needs power when there are outages? I think a lot of folks will hear the term securitization, which I will not go into, but the point is that this is a way for high risk assets like coal plants to be turned into bonds, which are less pricey for ratepayers. So this is a way for us to get away from the fact that coal plants have been built and we're still paying for them, even though we are moving away from using that energy because it takes years and years and years to pay off a coal plant through rates. What do we do with the fact that these coal plants are stranded? And And, you know, the only caution I would offer about securitization is it assumes that you should put the transition into rates. And there's an article I quoted in the references of these slides that explains maybe it's stockholders who should pay for us transitioning. You know, why should customers have to pay for this stuff? And that's a fair question. And then, of course, you know, any Green New Deal package has to include stuff about distributed generation, diverse generation, et cetera. Okay. Wrapping up here with one last case study. What's happening in Washington State is, I think, really cool. One of the readings that I made available was Puget Sound Sage's Powering the Transition, which starts with, you know, we as communities of color in the Puget Sound area don't care so much about the grid. What we care about is affordable cost of living, air quality, and family wage jobs, among other things, as those intersect with the grid. So don't approach us with like, we got to go 100% clean unless you're also addressing these things. And I guess I'd preface before talking about how cool CETA is, the Clean Energy Transformation Act, by saying that I was like just in a call with the Initiative for Energy Justice, which is this national sort of support system for environmental justice advocates in energy policy. And they, you know, there are mixed reviews of CETA and how CETA was written and what it's going to be able to do. So even though I think it's a cool tool, you know, far from perfect. But here's what CETA says. It says that Washington will go 100% carbon neutral by 2030. It allows for the possibility of performance-based regulation, which we talked about a little bit ago. It will incorporate the social cost of carbon into a lot of things that the utilities do, and into valuing resources. And the very unique thing is it says, in doing this transition to clean energy, you must equitably distribute the benefits and the burdens of this transition. And utilities are like, what does that mean? And of course, the advocates who have been working in environmental justice and equity for a long time are like, here's what that means. Like, this is how you can do that. But it's very cool that this kind of language is entering energy regulation now. And it also requires utilities to offer low-income energy assistance programs, which was not required before. And the other thing about 100% clean is fossil fuel jobs pay well. I think we heard another speaker say this. So in order to get unions on board, you need to offer tax incentives and real money in the game. And this law offers some tax incentive for unions. Questions or comments on CETA? Anything so far? I don't see any. And we're about to wrap up, so it'll be a better opportunity for general questions. You can go to the next slide, Nick. So takeaways here. Providing energy to people looks very different now than the way it was designed by the Rural Electrification Act, and it's going to look even more different going forward. We need to be cautious when we talk about fossil fuels as not just being, you know, environmentally dangerous, but as having a real tie to social vulnerability and colonization. And 100% clean shouldn't be the only goal. So I'd highly recommend folks, and this is in the reference slides, look at the 100% clean scorecard. It's a way to evaluate 100% clean policy that the Initiative for Energy Justice just came out with last month. It's not gonna be the best thing if we go 100% clean, but all of our, all generation is utility scale and central and very big. We need decentralization. We need inroads to make sure that we are not just consuming energy, but we are participating in the system. And lastly, resilience is important, but as Dr. Baker's article examined, maybe it's not the most important thing. And of course, what is the role of energy democracy and all of that? And the next 2 slides we don't even have to look at, but they are suggestions for things people can follow and resources people can look at who want to dig in more. And I'm happy to answer questions about them too, if there are questions. Okay, I'm gonna drink some water and stop talking.
I'm gonna stop the share here. That's okay. And then I'll send this out as an email next class. Cool. Any more questions here or comments? While we wait and see if some comments come, you know, the Pacific Northwest is very different than a lot of parts in the country, and folks are from all over the place. And like Heather mentioned, our energy grid is just fundamentally different. We don't have the same relationship with fossil fuels that a lot of other regions do. That being said, we've done, and probably because of this, we've had some really mature campaigns at fighting fossil fuel infrastructure, both stuff moving through here and then stuff coming online here, and a lot of tools for helping campaigns around the country get into this kind of stuff. And you know, utility level campaigning, there's a lot there, as Heather just showed us. And if you are watching this and you're kind of curious about how you and your community might get more involved in utility level campaigning, I would love to talk with you more about it. And I'm sure Heather wouldn't mind to share some of her expertise there as well.
Yeah, and I guess I would say I like serving as a resource, but you know, there are other people best fit to lead the charge. So yeah.
Other questions, comments while we've still got Heather on the line here? I'm kind of like, I didn't have access to the chat, but I'm kind of reading through it now. What's the #1 thing a massive infrastructure funding plan should include for utilities? Does Biden's new plan live up to the vision of energy democracy?
I think it was I think Biden's plan was released today, right? So I have not looked at it. I know that my boss helped contribute to it, but I am not best to say the second part.
Yeah, I haven't digested it yet.
I love the first question, Aaron. What's the #1 thing a massive infrastructure funding plan should include for utilities? Yep. I think we need to find a way to solve the problem that, again, the grid was built for things that it's not designed for. And so it's hard to say like the #1 thing in order to do that. But it can definitely look like accelerating the transition to distributed renewables for sure. So not just like large wind farms, but local solar. And rooftop solar is great, and it's not going to work for everyone. So ways for other people to benefit from distributed generation in the way that Dr. Baker's article talked about, I think I would throw in there too. But honestly, some of the stuff I'm most excited about in the Biden administration, and yes, I did just say I'm excited about things from the Biden administration, is Dr. Baker is part of the Biden administration now. She works as the Associate Director for Energy Justice at DOE. And they're creating an Office of Public Participation at FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, like not necessarily because of Biden, but because of pressure over and over and over. This energy industry thing on a national level is becoming a more people accountable thing. And I'm not saying that that will necessarily lead to outcomes, but for me, that in and of itself is a really big deal. So.
Yeah, there's a couple comments in the chat they think we might be able to take up here. One is about gas and the potential sort of like abandonment by some consumers into electrification and what that would mean for remaining users, which is a really important point. And then Micah has also noted that in Oregon, there's a bill that has a good chance of passing that would like create low income rate classes and stuff. I don't know if you wanted to comment on those things, Heather.
I would love to. And I'm a big fan of both Micah and Sherry. So thank you for contributing. Yeah. So again, the issue of let's get off of gas really fast. Who continues to pay gas rates as the wealthier folks electrify faster is a huge problem. And I was just on a call this week with some folks in Los Angeles who realized, so for one, they're gonna stop pushing for electrification as much as they want to, and start asking questions like, what does electrification mean financially and otherwise for certain communities that we want to benefit most? So they're kind of backing up from this transition thing and more, let's do more research on the implications of this. And the other thing is, and Sherry, I have your email, so I could totally just send this to you. There are ways that you can structure rates and who pays for what. So for example, industrial customers versus commercial customers versus residential customers. There are ways that you can make sure that commercial, for example, is paying a higher price for a certain part of that transition that residential customers don't get hit with. But again, that requires a little more creativity in rate design than we've had in the past. In the past, it was like all people in houses pay this for energy, all people in businesses pay this for energy, and all people in industry pay this. And it can't look like that anymore. You have to get a little more creative. So there are things that can be done about it. But I think the most important thing for advocates is to be, from my perspective, very cautious about electrify now without more research.
Yeah, and I'll give you a slightly different opinion on it, especially from the position of kind of like the future of gas. I had mentioned earlier that, you know, I anticipate like costs rising really rapidly on the gas industry, and I'm happy to share that with folks if you want to see that. But, you know, there's all this like epidemiological evidence that's arising around gas as well, and all of the impacts of like health impacts of like stoves and how those are exacerbated in like smaller areas, which are basically where like low income folks and then people of color tend to be living. And so there's huge justice impacts too as well. And the more you unpack it, you start to see like a cigarette company level like campaign to kind of like suppress scientific information for long periods of time. And so I think they're going to get this shit suit out of them by tort attorneys soon. That's what I think is going to happen. That's what my legal training taught me. And so as evidence comes out, this is going to be another cost that's going to be added, is like, are these companies just going to get like sued out of existence in addition to the other costs there? And so, you know, it is this huge problem, because when you start thinking about a system, if we take for granted that utilities just have a right to be, you know, remunerated for past investments, and investors should be made whole no matter what, then it's going to require some kind of bailout to transition and some kind of like big bag of cash to pay that out and go. And then there are other kind of questions of like, are there other creative ways to take this, or will the assets become so cheap over time that that cost won't be as high? But it really, to get off that now, absent a revolution happening, which probably not going to happen right away, at least in the way that people imagine it. Yeah, there's some kind of like big money solution. And to point out the potential for inequity there is really smart and really spot on, because if a bunch of people just kind of go and you don't provide any kind of like low income rate classes or any kind of like monetary shifting within that, then yeah, poor people are going to be stuck with like huge energy bills and it's going to be, you know, they're going to be breathing the bad stuff, using the fossil gas and paying more for it, which is a terrible, terrible, terrible outcome.
Speaking of which, I'm glad that Micah brought this up. I mentioned diverse rate classes, which is a fancy way of saying different people paying different amounts for energy based on who they are rather than how much that energy costs. And I think that's pretty fundamental when it comes to equity. And in the Oregon legislature right now, there's something called the Energy Affordability Act, which among other things would allow the Public Utility Commission to allow income-based rates. So based on your income, you're offered a different rate for energy. This is already happening in like 22, 23 other states in the country. So it's not anything new, but would encourage folks to check that out because, you know, that sort of thing allows us to think more about electrification more seriously.
Final questions. We've got just a couple minutes more with Heather. If there's anybody who wants to enter a last question in the chat. And you know, otherwise, I think, do you have any kind of parting statements for us? Any wrap-ups? And you know, like you foretold moments ago, who should people work with? Where should they go? Where should they devote their energy?
Do check out the slide that I put at the end. I love the Initiative for Energy Justice. And I like what's happening in Washington State. And I think I've talked enough, honestly. But I would maybe the parting wisdom I'd offer is, you know, I live in Portland right now, and I've been actively involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. And there are very, very real reasons for people to feel very angry right now, and even hopeless. Like there are some arenas where there is not any movement happening. And from my perspective, the energy system is not one of them. I see very, very cool stuff happening very quickly, in part because the market is driving it, right? Like people are like, whoops, coal, that was a bad idea. But also because there are so many people getting involved and making noise that are finally being listened to. So I find this to be a very hopeful space, believe it or not.
Totally agree with that sentiment. Well, thank you, Heather. It was great. Loved to learn a bunch from you, and I'm sure you'll be participating in future classes. So
always too much. Yes.
Thanks
for the invitation.
This will be up on YouTube, and we'll see you next week.